Welcome to another chapter in the Bay Area Radio Museum's Living History series. Of course, I'm Rosie Lee Allen. Ron Fell has had three distinctive careers while in broadcasting. He was a music director, a program director, and a sports producer. He was also co-owner of the Gavin Report, which at one time was considered to be the Bible for songs played on music radio from coast to coast. But his real passion began after he retired from media and became a volunteer in the developmentally disabled community. Ron Fell, welcome to your life, because this is it, my friend.
Welcome, Rose. I'm so glad to be here with someone I've known for 60 years.
And that is complete full disclosure, because it is almost 60 years.
Yeah, that's right, almost.
60 years would be a lot. How about 57 and a half, 58?
Okay, that's good enough.
Because I came to KNEW in 1969, but you had been there for 2 years before I got there.
I was studying radio, television, and film at San Francisco State. That's what the degree was called in those days. You had to take courses in all three disciplines. And was working full-time as a junior in college, working 55 hours a week for $1.17 an hour.
Practically a fortune.
As the gopher, doing a little bit of everything, helping out different departments, but getting tremendous exposure to how major market radio worked.
So honestly, you didn't really have a job, though, right? They paid you, but you didn't have a job.
Yeah, nothing that would have been. You wouldn't have seen that under job description anywhere. But it was great exposure for me, and that led to eventually becoming the music director there. Helped out a little bit more specifically in the programming department as the years went along. That started in '66. And I stayed there until the end of 1970, and worked my way up through the food chain. The station was owned by Metro Media, which had never owned any radio stations on the West Coast until it bought KNEW and KLEC in Los Angeles. Actually, KNEW wasn't the call letters, it was KEWB. And they changed the call letters to KNEW to synchronize with WNEW in New York, which was their flagship station.
And I remember it was owned by John Kluge, right?
Yes.
And and we had the art, because I was there for like 2 years, 2.5 years.
That's where we met.
Yeah, and then they had the art museum, which I guess Kluge was really into art.
Oh yeah.
And it was a beautiful space. That station was probably the most beautiful station I've worked in my entire career in broadcasting.
It was the entire second floor of the building that's still at 66 Jack London Square.
Yeah. And I guess that I've not been in there since I left.
Oh, it got chopped up into many different things, and probably the last radio station that was in there couldn't have been more than 600 square feet.
You had an interesting career at KNEW because, first and foremost, you never wanted to be on the air.
No.
But there were a couple of times when you had to be on the air. The one that I remember, and we talked about this, was when you had to do the interview with the famous producer.
No, a famous director.
Okay.
I was still the gopher at the station. It was the kind of station that they loved promoting brand new movies, and if a movie star that was going to be in a movie was coming through town, they made it a point of stopping by the station. And all of a sudden, the station got flooded with people promoting movies all in the same moment. And there was a celebrity and a major executive with different movies, and there was this third guy that showed up with his PR agent in tow, and he had an appointment to do an interview, but there was no one in the station to do the interview. So they come begging to me and said, would you mind just pretend we'll do an interview. You can roll tape if you wanted to. We'll tell them that the interview's going to run later, but we got to stay on the good side of the production company or whatever. And this is the person's first movie as a director, and I know you haven't seen the movie and you don't know what it's about, but can you do just 10 minutes? Can you help us out? So I said, okay, I'll do it. And faked my way through it. I'm convinced that it was not a good interview. It was never going to get on the air. And the tape got kind of put aside. And I discovered the tape about 15 years ago, and it was labeled correctly, but it was one of these small 3-inch reels, and I had nothing to play it back on. I had a friend in Maine that had a machine that could do that. So I said, look, I've never heard this thing. can I send you this? Can you dub it off onto something that I can listen to it on? He said, no problem. And he calls me a couple of days after he got the tape, and he said, it was a pretty bad interview. Who was it?
I know who it is, but I don't want you to tell everybody who it
It
was.
was Woody Allen. And it was the very beginning of his career as a director. So I don't know what the movie would have been, but and I have to this day have never heard the interview. I have no interest in hearing the interview, but that's how bad I was at the on-air portion of broadcasting, the announcer part of it anyway.
One of the things that you did was produced football. So how did you learn, first and foremost, how to produce a football game? And I know we're going to talk more later on with Stan Bunger. You're going to speak with Stan about sports.
We'll get
living
into the
history
weeds
sports.
with Stan, but what was happening was the sports director at KNEW when I first got there was a guy by the name of Barney Lee. And Barney Lee was the sports director, and for nothing better, he was given the responsibility of kind of marshaling the broadcast and make sure all the commercials ran and that kind of a thing. But he found out that the team was going to be playing in North Platte, Nebraska as part of the Nebraska Centennial against the Denver Broncos. And in order for the team to get from Oakland to North Platte, they were going to have to fly on a prop plane. And he was scared of flying in any case. So he goes into management about 3 days before the scheduled departure from Oakland with the team and says, I got to take my vacation or something like that. And they said, well, what are we going to do? We got to find somebody else. And somebody said, well, how about this kid, Ron, over there? He seems to be eager to do all sorts of stuff. We can try to explain to him what goes into producing a broadcast. And basically it was a stage manager to make sure all the commercial breaks got in and that kind of thing. Nothing difficult. The problem was that the broadcasting booth was a paint scaffolding on the 15-yard line of a high school football field.
Oh,
and that was my baptism of fire. I had 2 stopwatches and a clipboard with a log of all the commercials. And somehow we had to get it all in. Well, I apparently did such a good job, and I'm not being facetious, I really do think I did a really good job considering all the handicaps that we had with that broadcast, that Bill King went to management the next day on the Monday after we got back and said, the hell with Barney Lee, let's keep this kid Ron Feld as the producer. So that began a streak that ran until the Raiders played their first game as the Los Angeles Raiders in 1982. It happened to be at Candlestick Park against the 49ers as a preseason game, and I trained my producer who was going to then produce the games down in Los Angeles for all the rest of the season. So I figured my relationship with the Raiders was up and I wouldn't be dealing with them anymore because I wasn't moving to LA. And that was it until 2005. And in 2005, I started producing the games again, and I'll explain that on part 2.
Hold that thought, because Ron is going to be talking all about what it's like producing the Oakland Raiders and the San Francisco 49ers from the beginning. You said you just had 2 stopwatches and you were sitting on a
paint scaffolding.
Yeah. There's a lot more to that story, and he's
Well,
going to talk with Stan Bunger about John Madden, Scotty Sterling, Bill King, and all those guys.
Greg Papa, Joe Starkey.
Oh, yeah, Joe
those
Starkey.
are all the announcers, the people that held microphones. Gary Plummer.
Yeah.
Those are all people. I actually trained Barry Plummer. And Monty Stickles.
Yeah, and all of that is coming up.
And a surprise guest, if anybody can guess who the color analyst was for the Raiders on KNEW from 1966 until 1970.
I know, but that's coming up in a special edition.
Okay.
So we have to, because I know Stan is going to pull all of that out of you. It's called Living History Sports, and it's going to be hosted by Stan Bunger with Ron Feld. And it's coming up right after this.
My pleasure.
Yeah. Oh, so exciting. Well, getting back to your other lives in broadcasting, because sports, as you know, was a huge part of what you did. But in the beginning, your dream job was to be a program director. And that happened. When did that happen?
Well, graduating from San Francisco State, I was the only person I knew that was really interested in broadcast management. All my peers wanted to be disc jockeys, and they knew they were going to have to go to Lodi and do the all-night show or whatever to get their chops down and stuff, and I wanted to study broadcast management. So when I got a chance to I was leaving KNEW because the football season was over. The 1970 football season was over, and I was leaving KNEW, and I applied for the music director's job because I'd been the music director at KNEW. Applied for the music director's job at KNBR, and fortunately, and I didn't know this, the music director was leaving to become the sports director at WSB in Atlanta, and that was Ed Baxter.
Yes, and
So
X number of years later, 1984, I started working with Ed on the afternoon news.
he had
and
come
on
back to
KGO.
San Francisco, yeah.
So, you know, there's like, we have parallel lives in broadcasting
So
for that reason.
I was quite comfortable. About 13 weeks went by, and I was quite comfortable being the music director at KNBR. And as much as I didn't like what they wanted from a music director, I was perfectly willing to do it because it was an NBC-owned and operated station. And one day, Heber Smith, the general manager, and Bill Dwyer, the sales manager, called me into Heber's office, and they said, we're going to be firing the program director of the station, and we'd like you to be the program director. I'm 26 years old. Maybe at the age of 36, I would figure I might be qualified to be the program director of an NBC-owned and operated station, or stations in this case. But they offered it to me. I never applied for it. I was thrilled to get it. I got the job, never discussed how much money I was going to make, which turned out to be really low money. But that's because I accepted so quickly. And who was the first person I called to tell them that?
Me.
I called Rosie. Was the first person to find out that I had the job. And within 48 hours, you were working with me as my executive assistant.
Exactly.
That's how fast it worked.
Yeah, that was my road, part of my road to
Yeah.
becoming an on-air personality.
So I programmed KNBR. I was part of the group that convinced the Oakland Raiders to move their affiliation from KNEW to KNBR. Wouldn't say I was pivotal necessarily, but I knew something about it. And the Raiders, particularly Al Davis, was a big fan of mine, and he pretty much insisted that wherever the Raiders broadcasts were going to end up, he was hoping that I would be involved in the broadcast along with Bill King. We were pretty much an inseparable pair at that point.
Bill King was quite an interesting
So we did
guy.
this. I did program the station for a little over 3 years, and changed the music format. Having to deal with all the NBC features was difficult because you had 5 minutes of news on the hour and a 3-minute feature, including people like Ann Landers and John Chancellor or whatever doing bits, and 14 minutes of local commercials as well. And you try to win with ratings, and that can be pretty difficult. But we were the first station to beat KSFO in the prime time radio hours in 1975. That was my claim to fame. Having interned at KSFO and knew many of the people over there, I had hired Carter B. Smith from there, and yeah, so that was thrilling for me. And then I lost my gig there, and
No, tell the truth. You got fired.
I got fired. Lost my gig. Yeah, I don't know anybody in broadcasting that doesn't get fired at somewhere in 50 years.
I did.
And I did almost exactly 50 years because the year I was inducted into the Hall of Fame here was my 50th year. So.
Wow.
Yeah.
So you were fired from your dream job in 1975, and then what? Is this one of those parts of your life that changes?
I was asked, Bill Gavin called, the founder of the Gavin Report, which was a highly respected trade journal that did music research for American radio. But it was hardly sophisticated. All of his research was done with a pencil and an eraser, and his version of what would have been a spreadsheet in 1975, and tracking radio station airplay on formats of country, top 40, adult contemporary, and what we then were calling urban radio, I guess. Those were the 4 formats at the time. And he was going to go on vacation for a week and needed somebody to fill in. He didn't want to cease publication, but he was responsible for one of the more important formats of music, the research. And his normal go-to person was Al McGreer at KSFO, but she had other plans. So he called me and said, would you mind filling in for 1 week? And I said, no, thrilled, to take Bill Gavin's place for a week at such a prestigious publication as the Gavin Report. He asked me what did I want in terms of compensation, and again, I blew it. I said, how about a lifetime subscription to the Gavin Report?
No money.
No money again, how about that? But I was thrilled to do it. When he came back, I had shown him some of the flaws in his research and how if he did it a different way, which I did, I paralleled everything and did a different research, the research would be more accurate. And he said, that's really impressive. How would you like to do that on a full-time basis? And he would then no longer be responsible for the adult contemporary format at his publication. And so I took it over. And then 5 years later, he asked me if I wanted to be the managing editor of the whole publication because he wanted to phase himself out. I agreed to that. And I hired Dave Sholin to be my top 40 editor. Dave and I had gone to college together.
Yeah, I was going to say, tell us the story about how you found, how you didn't find Dave, you already knew Dave, but how he came to work at Gavin.
Well, he came, this was October of 1980, and I called Dave. He was living in Los Angeles, but he had been the music director at KFRC, and then he had moved to Los Angeles to be the group music director for all the RKO radio stations, which were a great bunch of top 40 radio stations, and he managed it all from Los Angeles. But I knew he'd never sold his house in Pacifica, and we had gone to college together and always stayed in touch over the years, and I needed a top 40 editor. Bill Gavin just thought I would become the top 40 editor, but I had no interest in that. That's not my format. So Dave agreed to come to work at the Gavin Report for pretty poor money, but he got a chance to work at the Gavin Report. He said, but I've got to take one night off. He says, I've got to take a day off in early December. He said, December 8th, I've got to go to New York to do an interview for my old employer. And I said, no problem, as long as you're back by Tuesday, because Tuesday is the busiest day of the week in that magazine, in that publication. So he took the day off, and he called. He didn't check in that day, but I knew he was doing this interview. And he did the interview. When the interview was finished, and it was in the Dakota, of all places, in Manhattan, and then he gave the recording artist and his wife a ride down to their recording studio down in Midtown Manhattan, and took the interview with all the tapes he had, got to a plane and flew home. And when he landed in San Francisco, he puts the tapes down on the passenger seat of his car, turns on the radio, and every radio station in town is playing Beatles music. And he's the last to know that his interview with John Lennon was the most amazing thing. So he calls me, he says, what do I do? He said, I've got the last picture of John Lennon ever taken and the last interview, which, by the way, on Thursday, a Steven Soderbergh movie called John Lennon, The Last Interview debuted at the Cannes Film Festival.
Wow.
And it was the interview with Dave Sholin that was the center of that whole Soderbergh movie, which is a semi-documentary. No idea when it's going to be released, but when it does, it'll be all about Dave Sholin and his crew of. He had an engineer and somebody representing the record label with him for the whole thing, and they were the main characters of this documentary.
That is really historical. Those are the kinds of things that people don't know. That's the behind-the-scenes stuff that people do not know. You had an opportunity to meet a lot of celebrities as part of the Gavin Report, and you were never affected by it because you never called me up and said, oh my God, I met Tina Turner today, or I met Whitney Houston, or I met Lionel Richie. What was all of that like throughout those years?
The interesting thing is you heard all these horror stories about rock and rollers and stuff trashing places and being complete assholes and all this kind of stuff. With the Gavin Report, we had such a pristine reputation and such respect from the industry as a whole. All the artists that we were ever exposed to were on their best behavior, absolutely from start to finish. Never had a single issue. They were always very careful. And then later on, as the magazine developed, we started doing cover story interviews with these people as well. And if some cases we did face-to-face, sometimes we did interviews on over the phone or whatever. But we were doing all the major artists of the time, and we were constantly being asked to go see the shows, whether it was a well-known celebrity or a showcase for a developing artist. I remember seeing a guy by the name of John Mellencamp, whose name was John Cougar was his name.
Sure, yeah.
And he played a show at the old Waldorf in front of 15 people and put on a show that was worthy of Springsteen. It was so good. to see something like that. And we were able to see artists at the very beginning of their career. I remember seeing Celine Dion when she was still a teenager and was learning to speak English and had finally released an album of English songs that she had recorded. Different stages of different artist development. And sometimes you saw some artists that were kind of on the way down and stuff, but
you don't want to mention any of those, right?
No. But yeah, developed decent relationships with a lot of these people, but always careful not to get too involved, almost always not to get too involved with the celebrity aspect of it. We weren't, but when you see so many acts, and for me, it was an average of about 3 acts a week, and that might include one show at the Coliseum or something like that, and maybe a stone at the boarding house and another one at Bimbo's 365 or whatever. We ran the whole gamut. It was the 2 main reasons for artists coming to the Bay Area were the Bill Graham organization and the Gavin Report. We were the constants through all the changes, and radio was constantly changing. KFRC was certainly in my years was a significant top 40 radio station, but they didn't cover the spectrum like the Gavin Report did.
Do you remember what you consider to be the best show that you saw during those years? I know there were a lot of really great ones, but can you name a few that you really liked? I know you saw the Stones.
Yeah.
But you weren't particularly impressed, or were you?
I saw the Stones 3 times, and I saw them probably at their best. 2 of those 3 shows probably were good. Sometimes you ran into artists. I was a huge fan of a singer, piano player, jazz singer by the name of Diana Krall. And I just love Diana Krall.
Sure.
But I saw her so many times. I saw her at her best and at her worst. I saw her do a horrible show at Yoshi's in Oakland. Mm-hmm. But I saw her at the Opera House in Sydney. I saw her in New York. I saw her do incredible shows. And probably one of the best CDs I've ever seen is a 2-hour live concert video called Diana Krall Live in Paris, which is just unbelievably great. And I still, when I fly, I have it on my iPad, and I literally watch it almost every flight I take. If it's a long enough flight, if I can watch a 2.5-hour music video, that's the one I'd go to.
So of your time at the Gavin, and I understand you sold it in...
sold it in 92.
92.
Bought it in 83 and sold it in 92, and then stayed on until 98 as part of a non-compete contract.
What was your most significant memory of that time? Or do you have one?
I think doing our annual conventions was just a hoot. We were the gathering point of all the record companies and all the radio music directors and program directors. And the relationship between the music industry and the radio industry was probably, as I would imagine it to be, between the pharmaceutical business and the doctors. If the doctors had a convention, the pharmaceutical companies were there to do the influencing.
Of course.
But we had, there were years where the whole profit of the Gavin Report was wrapped up in the profit we got from the 3 days of the convention, and we broke even the rest of the year.
Amazing.
Some of those years.
So that was your first retirement after you sold the Gavin Report?
My contract ran out in 98, and my wife caught me with my feet up one day, and she said, do something meaningful with the rest of your life. She said, you're only 53, and you shouldn't tell anybody you're retired. Just do something meaningful with the rest of your life. And it just clobbered me. I realized that I needed to do something more meaningful than catering to the celebrities and the athletes and stuff. I was around all the glitz and the glory and all of this kind of stuff. So I walked into a day program that was a big day program by the San Francisco Zoo called the Recreation Center for the Handicapped. And I said, you guys need volunteers. And they said, oh, we always need volunteers. A year later, I was their Volunteer of the Year, and I was asked to join their board of directors. So I was at both ends of their food chain. So I did my grunt volunteer work every Wednesday with a group of fairly high-functioning adults with developmental disabilities. And I had no connection with the developmentally disabled world. That was not, I didn't know people, all the years the next 20 years I was involved in the community continuously, and people would say, why are you involved? You don't have a family member, or do you have a, and I said, no, I just thought if I'm going to advocate for people, in other words, it's just doing something that I wasn't interested in the arts, the theater or anything, the libraries or whatever. I thought advocating for persons with developmental disabilities and speaking for them as much as I could as I learned the system was more noble than any other kind of volunteering that I think a person could do.
Well, but you became a huge factor in that community.
Eventually, not only was I on the board of directors of the Recreation Center for the Handicapped, I also was a member of the board of directors of the Association of Regional Center Agencies, which was a state-level responsibility, and I was also chairman of the board of the Golden Gate Regional Center, which is the state and federal funding agency for the San Francisco persons with developmental disabilities. So I did all of that until I was termed out by state law in 2018. And I haven't gone back to it. I probably could go back to it now, but I thought 20 years of volunteering, and particularly at the Association of Regional Center Agencies, the agencies combined, all 21 of them, had a collective budget of $7.4 billion.
Yikes.
And the 5-person executive committee, of which I was one of the 5 for 3 of those years, had the responsibility of managing the policy on how that money was to be spent based on the criteria established by the Department of Developmental Disabilities. But $7.4 billion to be spread amongst 350,000 people in 21 regional centers was the task. And it was so different from the radio industry or the music industry or the sports industry and stuff. It was very humbling, and it changed my life.
And it's important to point out that you were always a volunteer. You didn't have a paid job in that business. But all of those years...
I almost volunteered for the radio job and the Gavin job. I took whatever they were going to pay. I probably would have taken money if the agency had given me money, but I knew they wouldn't.
Of course not. Let's step back for just some seconds here. During the time that you worked for the Recreation Center, or you volunteered, I shouldn't say work because it was a labor of love, you were also still producing football.
Well, there wasn't as much of overlap. I started doing the volunteer work in '98, and that year, as a one-year project, I took over managing the broadcast for the 49er broadcasts, because Wayne Walker had retired from being the color analyst, and they had hired Gary Plummer, a former player, and a really nice guy and a very smart guy, but he had never held a microphone in his hand. And I didn't get a chance to meet him until the Friday before the game on Saturday, and he had to host the post-game show. I had to teach him not only how to do whatever he had to do as a color analyst during the game, but then Joe Starkey was going to be going down into the locker room, and we needed that 20 minutes. We needed somebody who had some sense of broadcasting to run the broadcast for that 20-minute period. But he was a good guy and really picked it up fast and did a good job.
Yeah, hold that thought. Another adventure in sports.
And I'm saving that for...
You'll be talking with Stan Bunger. I mean, you have so many sports stories that we really couldn't include them in this interview because your career in broadcasting has been so amazing. And you are one of those unsung people who really made a difference in the business, but not a lot of people know.
It's so great that you mentioned that, because even amongst my peers in the broadcasting business, so many of them thought of it as a job. And I remember that I learned the essence of communication from people like Marshall McLuhan and people who were the thinkers in the communications business in those days. Marshall McLuhan was a god to people who should have been a god to people in broadcasting. But I learned that if I was going to go into broadcasting as a profession, my job was to improve the craft of communication in some way. And that's why KNBR was so successful during my leadership, was that I was interested in the process of communication and trying to instill in the air people that were there the values that were necessary to be an effective communicator. and none of them had had a college education where that was drummed into you. And I realized that most of my peers, it was going over their head, and they didn't care because they were just trying to get a degree. But I thought the essence of broadcasting was so important that I think that made me a different kind of a program director than had been seen in most places.
That's probably
I was so proud of what we were able to accomplish as a full-service radio station, still dealing with the albatross of being an NBC-owned and operated station with so many minutes an hour of network obligations, and still be local the rest of the time.
You would have been a good program director for ABC, because that's kind of
I never
the
applied.
footprint
I never applied.
that ABC had. Okay, so you finally retired from pretty much everything in when?
2018 was when the
20,
developmentally disabled thing ran out. Meanwhile, I had been a professional photographer selling my photographs on the streets of San Francisco down by the ferry building and the Hyatt down there. There were a bunch of street artists down there. And I went through the process of getting permitted by the San Francisco Arts Commission. And I was selling my photographs on the streets every Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday for a few years. I did that. And then I drove for Lyft.
I was going to say, you were a Lyft driver.
In 2017, I surprised my wife one day and said I'm going to drive for Lyft. It wasn't doing something meaningful, but it was to keep me busy. I was driving 6 days a week, and every Lyft driver drives whenever they want to drive. And I was driving 6 days a week. For the most part, I was getting up and starting to drive at 1:30 in the morning, and I would drive until 8:30 in the morning, 6 days a week, and sometimes 7 days a week. I loved it so much.
Really?
And it was my wife, who's a CPA, said, "You're only making $8 an hour when you net it out." And I said, "I don't care. I'm having a good time." And I did that for, here were my totals. I did 37 months, 6,000 passengers, and 100,000 miles.
Jeez.
And the only reason I stopped was I picked up a nurse. Now this is very important. I picked up a nurse at the train station at 7 o'clock in the morning, and she was going to UCSF Parnassus up in the hills of San Francisco. She gets in the back seat of the car. I know it's a nurse because she had a uniform and she was going to UCSF, and I knew there was a hospital there. She spends the entire trip coughing into the back of my neck. And this is February 3rd, 2020.
Oh, no.
All right, the beginning of COVID.
Oh,
So
no.
I thought, oh my God. And there was no shield between the back seat and the front seat. It's not like a paranoid cab driver or anything like that. But I could not believe it. I didn't think of all the consequences and how bad that could have been. But I somehow knew, even on February 3rd, 2020, that coughing, being around anybody who's coughing, and this is a nurse going to UC, going to work. Okay, so I told my wife, and she said, "That's it, you're not driving anymore." And I never drove for Lyft again.
So you didn't get sick or anything?
No, I still have never gotten COVID.
Oh, lucky you.
Yeah.
Well, and then the most important thing, I'm categorizing
I'm trying to think where
this,
you're going, because I
I'm
thought you knew
categorizing
everything.
this as most important, is all that. Ron, you're kind of a little obsessive, because the next thing you did was travel, and you were flying all those miles.
Some people may remember a movie called Up and Away with George Clooney. George Clooney was taking the company miles. He was flying all over the place, accumulating miles for his company. I took it one step further. I didn't have a company. I had a lot of money that I had made from the sale of the magazine and all this kind of stuff, and I had not spent it on myself. And I decided that I would find time to fly to different places around the world and fly to that place and then just fly right back. So I would fly from San Francisco to Hong Kong, which was my favorite trip, and I was doing it 3 or 4 times a year. I'd fly to Singapore, same thing. I'd fly on a Thursday, get in on a Friday, spend the weekend, and then fly back on a Monday and accumulate miles. And eventually I was starting to get upgraded to every flight. I couldn't afford the business class flights, but I was ending up in business class a lot because I was accumulating so many miles. I ended up with 2 million miles in my United account alone, 2 million, and had not spent any of those miles. Well, did that. But my favorite places were Hong Kong, Singapore, Sydney, Australia, and London. Those are the places I went to more than any other places. And so.
And at some point, you lived in Australia because your
Oh,
wife,
yeah.
you haven't talked about your wife. She's an incredible lady. She's really smart, and she has this huge job which allows Ron to be able to do the things that he's been doing.
She was a CPA, but she specialized in things like HR and corporate finance. And she was working for a company that was, I'll keep the name of the company out of it at this point, but she was working for a company that was based in San Francisco, and it was privately held, but it was an investment bank. And she was working for them, but a number of the partners were Australian, and they decided in late 2004 to set up shop as a publicly traded company in Australia. So they moved to Australia and left a major presence in San Francisco because that's where all their business had been. And my wife was one of the people that helped anchor the San Francisco operation. But they needed her in Sydney for a project. So she flies to Sydney on a project, and she's there for a couple of weeks, and they said, would you consider living here full time? And she said, sure. And my husband and I had talked about someday living in Sydney, Australia, which would be great. So she agrees to do the move and calls me and says, we're moving in 2 weeks. I had to quit both boards, the board at the regional center and the board at the recreation center. I had a year's worth of Giants tickets. We had 4 tickets that we were charter seat holders at Pac Bell, which was, I don't know what it was called at the beginning. I've lost track of all the names, but I guess it was called Pac Bell. And I had to get rid of half a season's worth of tickets because I knew I wasn't coming back until football season, which was mid-baseball season. So I had to get rid of 4 seats for about 40 games in a span of 2 weeks. And then we left, and then every July I would fly back from San Francisco and do the football season. And then when the football season was over, I would fly back to my wife in January.
You have an interesting life, and you're having an interesting life. I think you write that book. It's in there. I know it's in there.
There's no book.
Is there one thing? Is there your final thought on your career? This is living history after all. Your career in broadcasting and media that you want to leave us with?
My wife said it all. She said, do something meaningful with the rest of your life. And when you have all the volunteer work I did with the Friends of Faith.
Yeah.
I did all the photography of Friends of Faith for a decade.
I forgot to mention that.
That's all right. I'm very proud of it, though.
I know.
I'm proud of it
as you should be, because you have an iconic photograph with all the ladies who were on the board at that time.
But no, she said, do something meaningful with the rest of your life. And there's nothing more important than that. And I was glad that I was able to wash myself of all the stuff from the celebrity aspect and the entertainment business and the glories of pro football and things like that. The selfishness of the people in those industries it's beyond, and just dealing with the egos of some of the people in broadcasting even. So, but I had the thrill of working with Frank and Mike and Carter at KNBR. I worked with Bill Gavin, Bill King. My father's name was Bill. My brother's name is Bill. So I had a chance to work with some incredible people. And they, if nothing, were the inspiration. They would definitely have been the inspiration to do something meaningful. I wish I could have been as important as they have been to me. I wish I could be that to somebody. But
well, I'm sure you were. I probably ask anyone in the disabled community that you worked with, and I'm sure they'll say, Ron Fell, oh yeah.
Yeah, no, I've been asked to go back and do the Association of Regional Center thing again, or to go back to the agency or whatever. But right now I'm enjoying not doing anything.
Well, your life is ongoing, and it's not over yet.
You're very lucky guy.
We're going to talk a lot about, we, meaning Stan Bunger, is going to talk with you a lot more about your time in sports. And then you can tell him about all the egos and because I happen to know about a few of them. Anyway, Ron Fell, thank you so much.
My pleasure.
I just love talking with you because you have such great stories, and fortunately I was a part of that. So
you are my Oprah. You are my Oprah.
I love being an Oprah. Nothing wrong with that. Just bring on the cash. All right, Ron.
Thank you. Thank you.
Well, Ron Fell is such a compelling storyteller and has so many stories to tell that we figured we needed a part two. I thank Rosie Allen for walking through Ron Fell's radio career and more in the first part of this two-part Living History broadcast. But what I want to do is get a little selfish here and talk to Ron Fell about sports, which is really my first passion. And within that, there's going to be a little bit about John Madden, a guy that touched both of our lives and careers. Ron, welcome back. Thanks for sticking around for part two.
My pleasure.
Now, how does a kid from Carlmont High School, all-league left-hander, wind up becoming Ron Fell of radio? Walk us through the part between a high school athletic career and becoming producer of Raiders radio broadcast, program director at KNBR as it moved toward a sports focus and so on.
I'd been a student at San Francisco State, and I decided to become a major in radio, television, and film in my sophomore year. Originally was going to be a psychology major, but there was too many books, and there weren't almost any books in the broadcasting classes. So I got into that, and at the end of my junior year, I'd gotten a full-time job working as kind of the gopher for all the different departments of the radio station at KEWB, which was about to become KNEW, but Metro Media had just purchased the station. And I had a reputation of being used for all the trivial stuff, including stamping the afternoon mail, washing the mobile units for the news department, dubbing tape.
So it was more than just fetching coffee. I mean, you were doing meaningful things.
Well, I thought they were pretty meaningful. No one else was going to do them around the station. And this was KNEW, and it was the second floor of the Port of Oakland building, which is still there. The radio station's not there, but it was a beautiful facility, and the station was owned by Metro Media, which had a station in New York called WNEW. So they changed the call letters to the Oakland station to KNEW, and it was known as Radio Free Oakland. It was the original promotional stamp was everything. It was graffiti and everything. It was subterfuge and the whole thing. And it was kind of a middle-of-the-road music radio station, but it had a talk radio show at night, which I ended up call screening and producing the Joe Dolan show at night on KNEW. And then I'd been there for a little less than a year, and the station was the flagship station for the Oakland Raiders. Actually, it wasn't. I wasn't there for. I was only there at that point for about 3 or 4 months. But the station was a flagship station for the Oakland Raiders broadcasts. And Barney Lee was the producer, but he was also the sports director of the station. And Barney was very old school, and he realized that coming up in the preseason schedule, the Raiders had a road game scheduled for the Nebraska Centennial. And they were flying in a team from Denver, the Denver Broncos, and they were flying in the Raiders from Oakland, and the team was going to be flying on a prop jet, on a prop plane, and Barney was not about to get on a prop plane, so he went in and said, I got to take a week's vacation. So all of a sudden they needed to find somebody to produce the games, and they basically said, you know, you've done everything else we've expected of you. We'll give you a clipboard and a stopwatch, and you can make sure all the commercials run and stuff like that, and do whatever Bill King asks you to do. So I said, okay, I'll do it. And got on the team plane with Bill King, and we flew to North Platte, and had to jump off the plane because they couldn't turn off the engines because they had the props going just enough so that so anyway, and we did the game, but it was a paint scaffolding our broadcast booth was just a paint scaffolding on the 15-yard line of a high school football field. And that was my baptism of fire, was somehow with the clipboard, and it was a beautiful day, fortunately, but this was August of 66, 67, somewhere in there. And that was my baptism of fire. But Bill King was so impressed with what I did with that broadcast, putting it all together at the last minute, that he went to management and said, the hell with Barney Lee, this kid Ron Fell a shot, and let him be the producer of the broadcast. So.
And you're on board. So let's walk back a little. This stadium, I remember Madden telling me stories about North Platte, and it's sort of part of Raider lore, this game played in North Platte, Nebraska.
Right.
Why?
Yeah.
Denver fans remember it too.
Yeah,
Why were they playing there?
Yeah.
Called these two teams out to North. Not that there's anything wrong with North Platte. It's a fine town. It's got
Yeah.
great railroad history and all that. But on a road trip one year, we drove by and I tried to find this stadium, and I think I found it, but I was so.
It was just a high school
football field.
They shipped in some seats from Lincoln, Nebraska on the train, so they had more seats, but they had no place for a broadcast booth. That's for sure. We stayed in the Pawnee Hotel, and my wife was trying to find me to make sure I got there. So she calls the Pawnee Hotel and she says, "I'd like to see. Can you transfer me to Ron Fell's room?" And the woman said, "Is he with the railroad?"
Well, that's a good bet in North Platte, for sure.
So there was the Pawnee Hotel and there was a Holiday Inn, and we were in the Pawnee, and the Denver Broncos were in the Holiday Inn. But we were in the Pawnee Hotel in North Platte, Nebraska, for 2 nights.
So I have a photo. I'm going to show you right here,
geez.
and we'll make sure we cut this into the final video.
I submitted that picture too.
Oh, you have? So you've seen this one.
Oh,
well,
yeah.
Explain who these 3 guys are in this photo here. I mean,
Well,
one of them everybody in the world
Bill
knows.
King is very photogenic. The guy in the middle was the best color analyst I ever worked with. That was Scotty Sterling. Scotty Sterling was an absolute gem. He had a great sense of humor. He did a real good job of understanding what the role was for a color analyst for a broadcast. And that's me with not gray hair and as the third person in the picture.
That's about a 25-year-old you, not even.
That would have been 70.
I think this
no,
picture
60.
is 75 if I'm reading
No,
newspaper. It's
no.
mid-70s, early 70s.
No, because, well, okay, it couldn't have been 75 because I left KNBR. No, that's right, I kept producing the broadcast. The Raiders insisted I keep producing, even though I'd left KNBR, they made me come back to produce the 75 season. And then I helped convince the Raiders to change stations again to KGO. And the Raiders ended up on KGO. But Bill King and I were the matched pair, and we kind of came with the territory. And at each station, we never did discuss my color analyst for the broadcasts on
in
KNEW.
North Platte.
Did you want to guess who it was for those 4 years?
You posed the question. I
You
started
seemed-
to bring Google and ChatGPT.
This was somewhere
to try
else
to
I
quit.
posed the question,
Yeah.
but you said you thought you knew. And he was a famous person in Bay Area broadcasting history, but no one would have ever thought of him in these days as being the color analyst for the Raider broadcasts.
I'm going to throw up all the cards.
Van Amberg.
Van Amberg was the color guy.
He was the color analyst with Bill King for all the broadcasts on KNEW, on KNEW. And then when we switched stations, Scotty Sterling, who had been the general manager of the Raiders before Al Davis, and had also been a sports writer for the Oakland Tribune, Scotty was the color analyst for all the Raider broadcasts on KNBR. And then when we switched broadcasts and went to KGO, Monty Stickles was responsible for being the color analyst for all of those broadcasts.
You worked with some colorful human beings.
Oh, major. I have the greatest respect for Bill King. He was just absolutely. I've always said that Bill King was the only person I know who could think ahead in terms of entire paragraphs in his head. You knew where he was going, and he was constructing amazing descriptions, particularly his pregame show. It was just unbelievable. He had a little bit of written notes, but he could do an entire paragraph without any reference at all, and it was as though he wrote it. It was like the Gettysburg Address, that kind of a thing. It was that good. So I got a chance to work with Bill King. I got to work eventually with Greg Papa, with Joe Starkey. My color analysts were Van Amberg, Scotty Sterling, Joe Starkey. The 49ers was Gary Plummer, who I trained to be a professional broadcaster in one day. And then back with the Raiders again, Tom Flores was the color analyst with Greg Papa for the 6 years I did the broadcasts on KSFO.
It seems you kept producing these football broadcasts long after you needed to. You'd already had a pretty fascinating career, and you were contemporaneously doing other things. Why?
Yeah. Well, first of all, my wife, if she ever sees this broadcast, would insist that I was lazy, that she never knew me when I worked 3 jobs. I also consulted 2 radio stations, and at the magazine, I used to we went to press at the magazine midday Thursday, and I would get on a plane and fly to Vancouver, Canada, where I consulted a Canadian full-service radio station, worked there until Saturday night, flew back to the Bay Area and did a football game on Sunday, and then back to the magazine on Monday. And I did that during the football cycle for at least 1 year. But by the time my wife knew me, I was down to leaving the Gavin Report and was doing Raider football. So she only saw me doing 2 jobs, and she didn't think that was such a big deal when she worked 60 and 70 hours a week in her financial stuff all the time. So it's been easier for me to be a professional who can dedicate a lot of time to whatever profession I had, because both of my wives over the years were incredibly professional and really obsessed with doing well in their jobs and being very successful at whatever they did. It just made that easier for me. If I had a wife sitting home nurturing 2 kids and wondering, why I was out so late or whatever, it would have been a whole different thing. But I always was challenged by wives, and even today my wife thinks I'm incredibly lazy. I'm not doing anything right now.
Well, you're sharing stories with us. That's valuable.
But she did say, do something meaningful with the rest of her life one time, and it stuck in my brain as the motivating factor for everything I've done in the last 25 years.
So, this is not an area that most people know much about. What is the role of a sports game producer?
It's kind of a phrase that gets thrown around to be too all-encompassing. I was actually referred to, and KGO at one point was referring to me as the executive producer, but basically a producer at its most elemental level is basically just a stage manager. You make sure the commercials run, you keep a log so that you don't miss running a particular commercial. If there's little bits of copy that need to be read, you've got to make sure they reach the right person on your broadcast, whether it's the analyst or the play-by-play guy. In my case, I was also doing a lot of stat work when we didn't have a statistician, and I was never very good at being a spotter, but sometimes have somebody sitting to one side of Bill King on the other would help him identify a different player's involvement in a play that maybe he missed or whatever. But I did the stats for Bill. All the years with Bill King, I did the stats. When we had the Raider broadcasts from 2004 to 2010, we had a guy by the name of, I can't remember his first name, but his last name was Chapman, and he was really good at stats, so I didn't have to do that. But there's basically anybody can call themselves a producer if they're responsible for the broadcast getting on the air. And in my case, I was getting involved in engaging the engineers and making sure the satellite feeds were cool and making sure the engineer had everything that they needed to get the broadcast from the booth up to a satellite, let's say, and then maybe from the satellite back to the radio station, and then it fed out to the network from there. There were different ways of doing things. I assume now they just use the internet and they don't need satellite connections to do broadcast quality efforts and stuff.
Yeah.
But a producer was the person who represented the commercial part of the broadcast and made sure that they were represented accurately, so you didn't have to make good on spots that didn't run, let's say. And it's very hard to coordinate the timeouts in a pro football game. There's a guy on the sidelines called the green cap, and the green cap is down there signaling to the referees that TV wants a timeout, and he's got a headset to the TV. And the TV, they're calling for a timeout. So watching that guy, I know that there's going to be enough of a break to get our commercials in. So I'm ready to tap Greg Papa or Bill King and say, we got to cut for a break. And they go quickly, they stop whatever they're saying basically and make room for the commercials to run back at the radio station. But during the week, I was responsible for station relations. Some of the network stations would have questions about the broadcast and the feed times, and could they get some extra promos from Bill King or Gary Plummer or Greg Papa for their individual radio station, and then we'd get them recorded and feed them back to the station. So you deal with a lot of details revolving the broadcast, and thus the announcers only had to worry about the game and nothing else. And my responsibility was everything except the game and to get the commercials in. And it got to be a challenge. Some sales departments were particularly aggressive with the amount of commercials they wanted to run.
That's an understatement.
Oh, man. But I was a hero to the sales department, and that really endeared me. The sales department always loved me for making sure that their clients were taken care of.
Ron, you were part of a broadcast that may, in fact, we haven't been able to find facts otherwise, have been the very first FM stereo broadcast of a National Football League game. And the game itself is memorable to Raiders fans because it was played not at the Coliseum, but at the University of California's Memorial Stadium on September 23rd, 1973.
That's so great. It's something I'm really proud of that just got buried. The moment it happened, it became a non-entity, and I'm really sad about that. But I was program director for both the AM and the FM at KNBR, and KNBR's FM, which later became KYUU, and a couple of other call letters. I can't remember all the other call letters that KNBR FM had become. But it was still an FM, and it was basically a beautiful music station that kind of sounded like KABL, a lot of instrumentals, and it kind of put you to sleep and stuff. And they were all on big, huge reels that you interchange the different reels so that the music was mixed. Never ran the same two things back to back. Anyway, I thought, geez, this beautiful facility. It's FM is not a big deal, but it's an FM station, and nothing much is happening on the spectrum. And the Raiders were going to have to do a home game because of the A's schedule that particular week. The Raiders had to play a game, and they chose to have their game at the Memorial Stadium. And you got the date is the 23rd of September or whatever. And we had to do some specific wiring for our broadcast in the broadcast booth that was going to be available to us. And I thought, well, geez, if we're going to have engineers out there with wiring and stuff like that, why don't we do a simulcast on AM, which would be our normal out, and on the FM, and do a stereo broadcast. And I don't think there were no important FM radio stations hardly anywhere in the world. KSAN maybe in San Francisco, but mostly there was no reason to listen to FM, so nobody really invested in those signals that were available to them. But NBC owned this station, and I got permission from the general manager from Heber Smith to do the broadcast. It wasn't going to mean anything to the sales department. They found out about it, but the broadcast was already sold out on the AM anyway, so it was the same commercials. And we got it wired, and we had, let's see, that would have been KGO. So it would have been Monty Stickles and Bill King, each with their own channel for their own mic. And then a bleed through, and then two crowd mics, and then a dual feedback to the station where everything was fed and then fed out to the individual station. The individual stations didn't get it in stereo, just KNBR FM was in stereo. I'm convinced it was the first FM broadcast of an NFL game ever. I can't prove it.
We haven't been able to find anything that would contradict that either.
No. But it came and went, and nobody cared.
Well, what that says a lot about, right, of course, is what the status of FM radio was in the early 70s, outside of a few niche formats.
Oh, that would have been Scotty Sterling. It would have been Scotty Sterling. That was KNBR.
With Bill, yeah.
That's right, yeah.
So let's bring up John Madden, who you were with the Raiders for a while, and John Madden and the Raiders are inextricably linked.
Great guy.
You were with him. Well, you need to tell the story of Madden's last flight with the Raiders, because so much of John Madden's lore, if anybody talks to you about John Madden, they say, well, he was afraid of flying.
Yeah.
Which
very,
is
very afraid of flying.
But you have the inside story of Madden's last flight with the Raiders.
I knew he was afraid of flying. It was common to most of us who traveled with him on the planes, and he never begged out to find another way to get to. He would have had to take a bus if we had a game in L.A. or San Diego or something like that. So I'm sure he complained, but it really wasn't obvious to us. We just knew that he was traumatized by the whole thought of flying. Well, we had played a game very late in the season. I'm not sure whether it was the last game or the next to last game of the season. Again, around in the 70s somewhere. Anyway, and John and the coaches and the owner sat in first class in this chartered plane, and the press, which were still in those days traveling with them, including Bill King and myself, sat in the middle of the plane, and then the back large part was where the players were. So at one point in the middle of this flight, and for some reason, some of the guys knew that I had a fascination with weather reports and weather broadcasts, and I studied weather charts a little bit. It's just that I was amazingly accurate. When Bill King needed something about the weather, I could tell him, and it turned out to be correct. So the bottom line was that we were getting up in the air from Miami, and we're flying at night because it was a late afternoon game in Miami. So we were flying at night, and we were going to be flying over the Gulf of Mexico. The only way to get to Oakland, you've got to fly over the Gulf of Mexico, and then eventually you get over like Houston, and you're fine over land. But he was worried about being over the Gulf for some reason to begin with, and he knew that I had a fascination with weather. And I guess because he didn't know the flight crew that well that were in the cockpit, I think he probably was introduced to them, but he didn't have a relationship, I guess. So he called me up, and I'd never been called up to sit with him, but he sent somebody to get me from the middle of the plane to come up and sit in the seat next to him in first class, which I did, and exchanged pleasantries and stuff. And he knew who I was, and I certainly knew who he was, but we'd never discussed anything of a business nature. And he says, "What do you know about the weather tonight?" And I said, "Well, I happen to know that we could run into some bumpiness because there's a lot of thunderstorms in the Gulf today and tonight. And if they're there in the daytime, they're there in the nighttime." So I said, "We have to worry about the first part of the flight, which we were already in the air. And by the time we get to a place like Houston or something, we're over land, and it would be a whole different story. And I think we should have a smooth flight from that point forward." So sure enough, the weather starts to get a little rumpy, and he has a relationship with the cockpit crew that he can access the jump seat in the cockpit and take oxygen anytime he wants. So that's what he did, because he had terrible ulcers at that point. It was nearing the end of the season, and they weren't doing particularly well. And his ulcers had caused him a lot of stress. So he goes and I didn't see it because I went back to my seat, but I understand he went and he sat in the jump seat in the cockpit for about half an hour and took oxygen. And it was a relatively bumpy ride, but I don't think it was anything to write home about. But again, it's just his concern. And I didn't see him again, but I heard the story from Bill King told the story that the next day, Madden goes into Al Davis's office and says, "You know, my doctors have told me because of my ulcers, I've got to take a few weeks off to get back to normal." And Davis says to John, "Well, we were going to fire you anyway." But he didn't say it quite. I don't know. I wasn't there. I don't know how it was phrased, and it was told to me third hand. But the deal was that they were going to pay him for the rest of his. He had another year on his contract anyway, which eventually became a problem for CBS because he signed a deal with CBS to do color broadcasting as a color analyst, but not until the third or fourth game of the pregame. In those days, the Raiders played 6 pregames. Everybody played 6 preseason games before the season started, and he
was under contract.
He was under contract, and but he sat with us, with Bill King and me and Scotty Sterling, I guess it would have been again, just to see what it was like to be in a broadcast booth, because up to that point, he'd never been in a broadcast booth. Now, we were radio, and he was going to be doing television, but he didn't know those guys, and he knew us, and he knew that his first broadcast with Pat Summerall was going to be the following week after spending portions of 2 broadcasts to see how we did what we did, which was just to understand the nature of broadcasting and stuff. There wasn't much to learn. But
he did okay afterwards.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. But despite his stuttering aspect, his and-does and things like that, and you knows, those were always a problem for him. But absolutely one of the sweetest guys on the face of the earth. I had one other story.
Well, I want to hear the one about, because you told Rosie the inside story of Dave Scholl in the last John Lennon interview, which centers back to the Dakota, that legendary apartment building in New York.
Okay, so John
Madden, this to me was one of the, as I got to know him a bit over the years, I mean, you couldn't make him up. Nobody would believe the story. But this guy comes from Daly City and stumbles his way through life and, is living with Yoko Ono as his neighbor.
yeah.
in the Dakota.
What happened was that somebody had convinced John that if he's going to have an East Coast base of operations, why not go for the Dakota on Central Park West.
Yeah.
And so he had gone through the application procedure, and he and Virginia, his wife, were in a snowstorm. We're walking down, which would have been 59th Street, which has the park on one side and the Plaza Hotel and that stuff. And my first wife and I are walking the other direction, and he and Virginia are walking towards us. And I recognized John. You recognize John a mile away, so I start waving to John, and he comes over and starts talking to me. And Virginia and my wife at the time start talking, but they realize that we two idiots are going to stand out in the snow. What turned out to be about 15 minutes of standing in the snow, and no one was standing in the snow but me and John, just because we ran into each other in New York. And they're laughing at us. They're underneath an awning of one of the buildings over there and stuff. They were not getting snowed on, but they thought it was hilarious. That was the last time I ever saw John. And I did call in. Unfortunately, I did not call in during the Stan Bunger years of
We would have welcomed
of John's. Yeah, but I did call in when he was on with Frank Dill. I mean, long after I left the station. I mean, I had put Frank and Mike together. And then John joins. I mean, had to be a great hour anytime you had Frank and Mike and John at different times. Frank was a good match for John. I think that worked out well. But they ended up transferring to KCBS. Who was the first person to deal with John?
So when Frank retired at KNBR.
Right.
And remember, John had moved to KNBR because Gene Nelson had retired.
Yeah.
And he thought, well, this Frank Dill guy, he's another old guy, and he'd been around, and it turned out, as you said, to be magic.
Yeah.
So Frank retires. There's a brief interlude with Steve McParland. That didn't work. Brief as in weeks.
Yeah.
And John has passed the word that he doesn't want to go back and do that anymore.
Yeah.
And Ed Cavanero, who was the longtime news and program director at KCBS, finds out that Madden's dissatisfied. I think Kevin Radich was the go-between, Kevin the Rat. And so Ed reaches out, Sandy Montag, John's longtime agent, works the whole thing out, and Al Hart was doing the mornings on KCBS, and John thought the same thing. He's another old guy, he's been around a long time, we get along just fine. And the kismet there turned out to be that John and Al were both natives of Minnesota. So there was this immediate
Turducken, the Turducken.
Turducken, yeah. Well, Ron, before I wrap up with you, sports on the radio is such a central part of the century plus of radio broadcasting in America. As you reflect on a long piece of that era, why did sports work so well on the radio? How did it connect so well? What was the central theme of sports and radio in America?
I think it was baseball more than anything, more than any other sport, because you had even in those days, 150 broadcasts. And you could be in people's homes 6 days a week for 3 or 4 hours. And that probably conditioned the American public to accepting other sports. And I don't know what came next. Football probably came next. Basketball was a little late. Hockey's never really caught on as a sports thing except in the big hockey towns. It doesn't happen everywhere. I think our teams in the Bay Area have done particularly well with their play-by-play people in all of their sports. I'm proud of what I contributed to. There were some other meaningful people that produced broadcasts and in different sports. 49ers had a couple of really good guys doing the broadcasts at different times. Basketball, Bill King did basketball.
He sure did.
And Mike Marquardt was an institute, and Peter Muley, who was Franklin Muley's son, were also involved in the old Warrior broadcasts. And Bill King was just brilliant in basketball. I think he was probably as good in basketball as he was in any sport. The thing that he loved about baseball were rain delays. He loved rain delays. And I don't mean that facetiously. He really loved rain delays. Give him a chance to talk on an extended theme. And
Yeah, as long as they weren't in Texas, because he wouldn't make that
yeah,
trip.
oh yeah, all of our guys are prima donnas. You think of all the places the different announcers won't go. The Giants broadcasting crew has been notorious for that over the years, and they build into their contracts that they don't have to go to Cincinnati or Detroit or whatever. They're built; those are written into their contracts, and that's why they say they were on assignment. But
Imagine broadcasters being
Yeah.
prima donnas.
I dealt with quite a few egos, but I'll tell you, that crew that I worked with at KNBR with Frank Dill and Mike Cleary and Carter B. Smith, couldn't ask for more professional guys to make my job easy. And dealing with Bill King, man, I get credit for good broadcast because of Bill King. And Greg Papa was one of the hardest working people I ever knew. Greg and I were the only people that were working on a broadcast prep on a Saturday night for a Sunday game, both of us in our hotel rooms dealing with details and stuff like that. I love that in guys that take their job seriously. And Joe Starkey was good. These guys were capable of doing a college game on a Saturday and a pro football game on Sunday, and giving me heart attacks flying all night to get to the broadcast.
Oh
and
yeah,
stuff.
some of the Starkey stories.
Oh,
Ted
man.
Robinson did
Starkey
some of those
made
too,
one
didn't
by
he?
about 5 minutes.
Yeah.
He'd done a Cal game, and he had to be in New Orleans the next day at the Superdome, and he shows up 5 minutes before air. I don't know what I would have done. What would I have done for a broadcast team if both of them weren't there? I mean, the show must go on.
Well, Ron, thank you so much.
My pleasure.
Great stories. What a great career. And it's I think for us all is here at the Bay Area Radio Museum and Hall of Fame, fascinating to hear the behind-the-scenes stories, because so much of what tends to get saluted is what's on tape and what the publicity photos show, but to hear the stories from behind the scenes, without which the rest of it couldn't have happened, are important.
They're easier to tell when you're no longer doing the gig.
For sure.
Yeah.
Ron Fell, thank you very much.
My pleasure. Thank you, Stan.